Good evening. Welcome to Calvary Chapel, Ponche Junction. My name's Noah, and this is the last week of the book of Ruth. We're going to be in chapter 4 tonight. Getting giggled at by my little sister over here. What's so funny? Share it with us. I won't put her on the spot. I'll stop. Go ahead and join me in prayer, and we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 4, verse 11 tonight, and we're going to finish all the way out. Lord, I just thank you for this night. I thank you for your word. I thank you that you give us direction, that we can come, we can seek you, and we can find you, and you can speak to us on an individual level, Lord. And I just pray, Lord, that you would just remove all distractions, whatever may have our minds wandering right now, that we can just meet you here and hear what you have to say to us, Lord. So just fill me with your Holy Spirit, God, to prepare our hearts and minds to receive in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right. So Ruth, I will go ahead and go through kind of where we are up to this point, just a real quick recap. We have Ruth. She was a Moabite. She was a foreign woman. She married into an Israelite family, and all the men died in the family. And so Naomi is her mother-in-law. Her and Ruth go back to Israel, and Naomi's returning to her faith while Ruth is finding a new faith. Now, when they arrive in Bethlehem, they're in need, and so Ruth, carrying out the law, goes and gleans in a field. The field that she happens to be gleaning in is a guy named Boaz, who holds a redeemer role in her family line, because he is related to Naomi's husband, whose name was Elimelech. But Boaz, he is a completely selfless person. He really cares for Ruth as well as Naomi, and he is not trying to put that right of redemption onto her. He's completely letting her just be blessed by the provision in which God has provided him. And so Ruth works in his field for 7 weeks. After about 7 weeks, Naomi is looking out for the best interests of Ruth, and probably herself too. And so she tells Ruth and how she could prepare herself in order to go to Boaz to ask to be redeemed by him. She goes and she does this, and Boaz happily says, I will 100% do this. However, he's a man of integrity, and he recognizes that there's somebody that has the first right to her, to redeeming the field as well as the situation. And so he says, I'm going to go and handle with that guy. If he wants to redeem you, that's just the way it is, because that's the way Boaz is. He just deals with things in an upright manner. So he goes before this man immediately the next day, and as he reveals the situation to the man says this is not something that he'd be willing to do. And so Boaz happily accepts the redeemer role, and the transaction is placed. And so that's where we left off, the end of the transaction. And now the people are going to begin to speak blessing onto Boaz and Ruth. So let me turn this light on so I can see something. Got this all wrong. Verse 11. It says, if I can find it, then all the people who were at the gate and the elder said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. So we talked a lot about how the Israelites, they were very well versed in genealogy, history, law, even prophecy. They knew their story very well. And so there's many things I think that Boaz is probably thinking about, these people are thinking about, that just kind of resounds within the crowd. One of these things it's interesting is now Ruth, she's not called a Moabite in this instance, so that name almost kind of drops off of her, that past baggage that her mother and the genealogy that exists within that sin is there. And they begin to identify her with the matriarchs of their faith, saying, I want you to be blessed like Rachel. I want you to be blessed like Leah, who are the women who bore the 13 children, which ended up being the tribes of Israel, to Jacob. And then it goes on to say, well, actually, before we go on, there's a couple different places I think that one for sure that we need to talk about. And that's Genesis 49:10. because prophecy really matters, I think, in the grand scheme of all this, because we see this is where the first king of Israel is actually going to be named, and this has a lot to do with it. So Genesis 49:10, I'm going to read New King James Version in this instance, because there's a special word there. It says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people." This is a blessing that was spoken on Judah by his father Jacob. It also happens to be a prophecy. It's speaking to the fact that Judah, and through his line, that he's going to have, there's going to be a ruling lineage through his family, and they're going to continue to rule until Shiloh comes. Shiloh is well known, even the Israelites, the Jews know this to this day, that means Messiah. ESV says tribute. That's why I said it in New King James Version. I like the word Shiloh. And we also believe the same thing. Shiloh is the Messiah. David Guzik says in his commentary, "From David until the Herods, a prince of Judah was head over Israel, even Daniel in captivity. The promise was that Israel would keep the scepter until Shiloh comes. Even under their foreign masters during this period, Israel had a limited right to self-rule until AD 7 at that time. Under Herod and the Romans, their right to capital punishment. A small but remaining element of their self-governance was taken away." So literally, Judah had many descendants, but Boaz is one of the descendants that this is actually going to start to be fulfilled, because a king's going to be produced, and ultimately this king is going to lead to the Messiah, and we believe this was accomplished through Jesus Christ. Now, the Jews, the Israelites, they missed it completely. They thought the Messiah was going to be a political savior, somebody who was going to redeem their circumstance. They weren't under oppression of the Roman rule. They missed that he was coming to do something much greater, which was to redeem them from their own sin, that he was going to be the Passover lamb for them once and for all. But they missed that, and it's actually a big problem then and to this day that the scepter did depart and that Shiloh has not come. They do still think that Shiloh will come. They believe the Messiah will come. But it is kind of sad that they missed it. But Boaz is going to be part of this to play out. Now, going back into verse 12, I believe, is where we are. It says, "And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Woman. So another thing is presented, and certainly I think that this would bring up within Boaz's memory. They're well-versed, again, like I said, in their history, their genealogy, of a similar situation where his relatives were also put in a redemptive role, but they did not act in the same upright, integrity-driven way that Ruth and Boaz did. In fact, from Sarah, even beyond Judah, a lot of the line that existed, there was quite a lot of drama. They frequently got involved in things they didn't, and you see a lot of the time that people try to push the will of God and try to accomplish certain things, and God doesn't need them to do that, but he redeems them anyways. But by the mere fact that God chose people, people are messy. They do a lot of horrible things, and that's recorded here within the book, within the Bible. That's just the way it is, and God records that. But we get to see his grace poured out in these situations, especially because he used these people to produce not only the king of Israel, but ultimately the Messiah. So we're going to read about Judah and Tamar, and we're going to contrast it a little bit with Ruth and Boaz, and a situation in which things were not handled in the way that I think God would have wanted to. So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 38. We're going to read this account. It's pretty crazy. Again, people are horrible. I'm horrible. We're all horrible. That's the reason we need a redeemer. But this is a especially messy account. So Judah, he's one of the sons of Jacob. This story actually happens in the middle of the Joseph story. And Judah is somebody who has a pretty cool redemptive arc, actually. He goes from someone who, when Joseph is thrown in the pit to be sold into slavery, well, first they intend to kill him. Judah is the one who says, hey, maybe we should sell him into slavery first. Kind of a good thing, but at the same time, you probably shouldn't be selling your brother into slavery. You probably should just deliver him 100% from your evil brothers. But that doesn't happen. Then this situation goes on, we're going to read, but eventually he does, when he's before Joseph, and Joseph wants to take the youngest brother, I think it was Benjamin, Judah steps up in substitution and says, take me instead. So there's a really cool redemptive arc there. But anyways, we'll read Genesis 38, starting verse 6 here. Judah had three sons to start off, Onan, and Shelah. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they were born in that order. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. So I talked about in the first chapter of Ruth how Elimelech and his sons, I couldn't say that they're necessarily judged according to what they did, because it doesn't say that, and that there was some that were. This is one of them. Was judged according to his wicked deeds. God killed him, had him killed. I don't know how. But then, verse 8, Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law." Need to make sure I'm on the right page here. The duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went to his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. So here we have Onan, who's next in line. It's interesting because the law hasn't been given yet in a written way. Moses obviously hasn't come yet. This is way after Joseph, and this is at the beginning of the Joseph story. But there was still some understanding of the Levite law, which was Deuteronomy Chapter 25, which is where you were supposed to you were supposed to step up and provide a son on behalf of the deceased. And that's what Judah was telling Onan that he should do. And Onan, he tried to save face and look like he was doing the right thing. You know, he's going in his tent and doing what he needs to do. But in reality, he lacked all integrity. He wasn't fooling God. He might have been fooling the people around him. But he's taken advantage of the situation, but that would end. You know, he wasn't going to pull one over on God. And in verse 10, it says, what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So now we have two sons that have been struck dead. And there's definitely a lesson there, and that we might be able to fool, each other. I mean, I could get up here and tell you guys all kinds of awesome things and preach and teach the word, but I think this is, even in reading this, it's kind of scary. It's like, man, you really got to live it out, because I'm not pulling the wool over God's eyes. He sees how I'm living. Likewise, he sees how all of us are living, and he saw how Onan was living, and that he wasn't acting in integrity, and he struck some down dead. Then Judah, verse 11, said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. So Judah says, Tamar, go back to your dad's house. When Shelah grows up, you can have him, and he will give you an heir. But there's some fear there involved, obviously. I mean, two of the brothers have died. I don't know what they knew or they didn't know, but that probably would cause quite a bit of fear. But in verse 12, in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. So here, after Judah's wife has passed, he's had some time where he has gone through the grieving process. He goes to oversee the sheep shearing process. And again, this is where I start to see some of the contrasting, comparing. Similar, but not the same. But Boaz, likewise, he oversaw the process of the reaping of the grain, of the threshing of the floor. He was very present in this situation. Judah, likewise, is going up into this situation where he's overseeing, and this is where this relationship, this unholy act starts to begin. And in verse 13 it says, "And when Tamar was told, 'Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep,' she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage." So Tamar finds out that Judah's on his way to oversee the situation. Shelah's grown up, and so obviously he's not going to be given to her, and so she decides that she's going to take things into her own hands. And so now Tamar, again, contrasting Ruth approached things in the right way. Boaz was out there working, overseeing that situation, but Ruth prepared herself as someone going into marriage and requesting that, the correct situation take place, where you have Tamar who's dressing in a way to appear a certain way, but it's not to marry Judah. It's to trick him into a situation. It's to trick him into being a redeemer. So you can already see in the way how these two separate individuals, one is doing this with integrity, and one is doing this completely from these selfish desires with no interest in necessarily how it could affect the other person. And so verse 15, when Judah saw her, He thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" So Judah sees her as a prostitute, and he goes, "Hey, to have relations." And she's like, "Well, what are you going to give me?" They're starting to work on these negotiations. They're figuring out the price for this unholy act. And he answered, verse 17, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her, and he went into her, and she conceived by him. So he goes, "Hey, how about I pay you a goat?" And she goes, "Well, I need collateral for this goat. What are you going to give me so that I know that I'm going to receive payment?" And he's like, "Well, what do you want?" And she's like, "Well, give me your signet cord and your staff. These representations of you and your family. And I'll hold on to those, and then I'll get my goat eventually." So the price is settled, and he goes into her, and she conceives and bears a son. So verse 19, "Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, 'Where is the colt prostitute who is at Anam at the roadside?' And they said, 'No colt prostitute has been here.' So he returned to Judah and said, 'I have not found her.' Also, the men of the place said, 'No colt prostitute has been here.' And Judah replied, 'Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her.' So Judah merely says, we tried our best. We tried to pay the price. I'm not getting my stuff back. I don't really want to deal with this anymore. It just is what it is. Let's just let it lie at this point." And so, 24, about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." So now Judah finds out that Tamar's pregnant, and he's lit. He is so mad. He's like, "Let's burn this girl at the stake. I cannot believe she's done this thing." And he's frankly an idiot. I mean, here's this guy. He got his daughter-in-law pregnant. He slept with who he thought was a prostitute 3 months ago, and he has the right to go and try to call this upon her and say, "You need to die on this. This is a complete wrong." And he's completely wrong in this situation. And I think it's, I look at Judah, though, and I see sometimes myself in a way, and that it's so much easier to look at sin on other people, and it looks so much uglier than it does on myself. I have mercy on myself. I justify it with myself. Frequently, I'm the victim of my own sin. I don't take responsibility for it. And Judah is not taking responsibility for it in this way, and he is dead wrong. And so, verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." And so she, with this trick up her sleeve, these two people just looking after themselves, and one just thinking about his pleasure, and the other just trying to trick him into a better situation for herself. She pulls the trump card here, and she goes, "Well, this is who I'm pregnant by," as she presents the stuff to Judah, which is his own stuff. And Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. So at this moment, he realizes what's happened. He, in a way, admits his wrongdoing. But this is the exact reason why we really need to be gracious with each other. There's so many times, like I said, we see our sin on other people, and we're different when it's seen on us. We're more gracious to ourselves, when really we need to be more gracious with other people, because we don't know the situation. Matthew chapter 7, verse 5, which I talked about, 8 months ago, but it's just a verse that really rings out, especially in this situation, in which verse 5 says, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." We need to do a lot of introspection. This is not saying that we shouldn't go and shouldn't talk to our brother, but we should be gracious. We should do introspection. We should be able to look at our own life and say, before I go to somebody else, what wrong may I have committed? Judah's definitely not practicing this. He's practicing self-pleasure. He's practicing just looking after his own moral code. He doesn't have this true care for Tamar. He would have provided her his son and really trusted in the Lord and the law that God provided. He would have been like Boaz, somebody that dealt with this woman with integrity and an upright manner, and God would have blessed him according to that. But God uses people like this, thank God, because we are all like this. We're all sinners. We all need redemption. And I'm glad that he does choose messy people, because I certainly am messy. And we see at verse 27, when the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore, his name was called Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. I don't know exactly how, I'm not a woman. I don't know birth, I guess, that well. I saw our daughter be born, but I don't get how, somebody could come out first, and then all of a sudden, another baby, just passes by. If you could explain to me, that'd be great. But that's what happens. And I think that Boaz has to be thinking about this situation. He has to be thinking about how, in his family, things weren't dealt with in the correct way. And the Israelites, they were given the law. They were given the oracles. And in reality, Judah and his line, they're no better than the Moabites. Nobody had any business judging Ruth based on her family history and where she came from. The Jews were just as bad, and if God could redeem Judah and his family in that situation, he certainly could redeem this faithful woman who has put her trust in God and put her trust in the law and submitted herself under a redeemer. And so moving on, in Ruth chapter 4, going back, Boaz does do it right. This is the order of things. So Boaz took Ruth, verse 13, she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So Boaz makes her his wife. They have a son. This son ultimately is going to lead to, obviously, what we talked about, Genesis 49:10, that the fulfilling of that, as there's going to be a king that comes from this line that's going to maintain rulership until ultimately the Messiah, the ultimate blessing, is going to come, and it's coming through their family. So verse 14, then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a store of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons and has given birth to him." So now this blessing is poured out upon Naomi. And again, this is another good contrasting point in Naomi from chapter 4 to Naomi in chapter 1. Naomi means pleasant, and she certainly is blessed. However, in the beginning, she thought that God had dealt so bitterly with her, that he was doing these things against her, that she was like, "Stop calling me pleasant. Stop calling me Naomi. Call me bitter. Call me Mara." That's the new name she wanted to be identified by. But regardless of her attitude, God was moving on her behalf, and he was going to bring life into this tragedy that they experienced with their husbands dying, with no heir left over. And Naomi was a child of God, but she had this bad attitude. But again, it just speaks to me that God is still just moving on her behalf, and he's going to bless her more in this circumstance than he ever did even in the beginning. She came in with nothing, but she's returning with just excess. And what comes from this family not only just blesses Naomi, but blesses the entire world. The Messiah comes. It's somebody that ultimately is going to be something that's not just redemption just for her and her family, but for the whole entire world. And it's going to come by Ruth, somebody that's not even an Israelite. She's a Moabite. She's not even physical blood, but yet how is it that she can bless Naomi beyond 7 sons? It's because she can actually bring life into the situation. She brings an heir that they're all going to experience this inheritance from. And like I said, ultimately, the Redeemer of the world. That's a pretty awesome thing. And they probably know that now. I bet they're in heaven, and they're just like flabbergasted that they got to be picked for that. But verse 16 and 17, which my Bible, it's windy up here or something. Keeps blowing things around. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, who was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So finally, King David is named here. Certainly a famous king, kind of like his origin story in a way. This is his beginnings, because again, this happens right before 1 Samuel. So the time of the kings is going to be ushered in here. Samuel, being the last judge, is going to anoint Saul, and then eventually David. So here we go. Let's go into the genealogies. This is actually really interesting. Now, these are the genealogies of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. So Frank asked me a really good question last week, and he was like, well, if Redeemer redeems somebody on behalf of the dead, shouldn't that guy's name be on it? Shouldn't this be Malone's son? Shouldn't it be credited to him? Which is a very interesting question. So looking into that, this is not the only case that we actually see this. There is, I only looked up one other one. There probably is more, but there is actually precedent for this. Perez was accredited to Judah. If that would have been the circumstance, you would think it would have been credited to heir, not to Judah. So there is precedent here. But also another thing that people like to say is that, like Obed, yes, like legally he did inherit Malone's inheritance as well as Elimelech's, but equally he inherited Boaz's. He was equally his son. And so it's kind of a moot point, but why wouldn't you name the better father in this circumstance? So that's another person's reason. But ultimately it's a technical issue, which we do have precedent to cover. But one of the more interesting things is, and the law, which we started out with in the very, very, very beginning, which is Deuteronomy chapter 23. We'll go there. Deuteronomy chapter 23. I mentioned it, and I said that this applies to the Ammonites and Moabites, but it also has other significance later on. So we'll kind of bring it full circle here in a way, but we'll read 23, 2 and 3. No one born of a forbidden union may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. So Ammon and Moab certainly were ones of forbidden union. They were banned from being a part of the assembly, which was taken to mean two things: not being allowed in the tabernacle, there's no temple yet, and you are not allowed to be part of the ruling class of Israel. And so Ammon and Moab certainly checked off this box because they were the result of an incestuous relationship. And so they were ousted from that situation. And Ruth now at this point, she's way further along than the 10th generation. You know, this happened at Abraham's time. But one of the other things that the Israelites or the Jews like to say is that this doesn't apply to the women of Moab or Ammon, which I think is interesting. I don't know if I really prescribe to that, but that's neither here nor there. But God didn't want his people to be partaking in this thing. He was nation building. He was setting forth precedent because this one was wrong, but two, it could cause a lot of problems down the road. Now, I do think it's interesting to note that it seems to me that Perez would have been somebody of a forbidden union. I mean, Judah slept with his daughter-in-law. They both lied to each other. They dealt with each other in such a shady manner. And so it's very likely that Judah's son Perez for the preceding generations would have not been allowed in the tabernacle, possibly, but certainly would have not been allowed to rule, which that's really interesting because if you literally count, if we go back to Ruth, and you count the names, you go Perez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. He's number 10. I think that's super interesting. I think there's something to be said there, but I think one of the biggest things to be said is it really doesn't matter, I think, our background. You know, that is the law. I'm no longer bound by the law. But where I've come from or what I have done, God can use us. He uses people. You know, he used people that made many mistakes. He redeemed people who had done bad things and turned their deeds around in order to be things that glorify him. You know, if God can use the great-grandson of a Moabite to be a king of Israel, he can do certainly great things with many of us. You know, there's many undesirables that we read about in the Bible. We read about Ruth. You know, she's not undesirable, but the people of Israel would definitely say, you know, she's a Moabite. She is a result of an ancestral relationship. They were told not to intermingle with those people. They would have thought of her as an undesirable. They would have chosen her to be not only the great-grandmother of the greatest king of Israel, but ultimately the Messiah. They would have not chosen that. But God frequently chooses those things that are weak to confound the wise. You know, Boaz looked at Ruth and he saw past those labels that she was wearing as a Moabite, and he saw her character. He sat with her for 7 weeks. You know, they would have meals together. He saw her working the field, and not just on behalf of herself, but on behalf of her mother-in-law. He saw that when she came and asked to be redeemed, she did it humbly. She could have gone after all these other different situations, younger men, richer men, poor men, whatever the situation, but she was not just looking out for herself. She was looking out for Naomi as well, and he saw that character, and that was enough for him to go and redeem the situation, to act with that man integrity. The whole situation was completely worth it to him. He's willing to pay the price in order to receive her. And there's so many parallels that I can see. That's why I love this chapter. That's why I love just Ruth in general. It's the New Testament and the Old Testament. It's the gospel. We get to see the redemption. We get to see that Boaz paid the price because he wanted the relationship with Ruth. Jesus is willing to pay the price because he wants relationship with us. I think that salvation, eternal life, is merely a benefit from being in relationship with the Son. It's the inheritance of the Father that he gives us, but it's that loving relationship that he really desires with us. And so that's what I just see all over this book. And I just see how, especially in comparison to, and I say it's the New Testament and Old Testament because, Judah and Tamar, that's Old Testament too, but you see so much more integrity and faith and love and hope and goodwill towards these individuals together. But, just in this whole book, you see how God has taken just some of the more plain aspects like history and genealogy and prophecy, and he has weaved it into this situation where two people are coming together, and in the midst of their family's decisions, in the midst of their faults or who they were or what they have done, God produced not only a king, but ultimately the Messiah. So that's where we're going to end tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed Ruth. Hope you stick around for fellowship. Next week, we're going to do, I think, a worship night, some fellowship, and just some food, right? Yeah, I think that's what we're doing. And then the preceding week, we're going to have Jason. He's going to teach 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John's. Coming out for that. It's going to be a great time. So yeah, let's go ahead and pray. Lord, I just thank you for this day. I thank you for your Son, God. I thank you that you provided a way out of our situation, that we could just rely and call out to you, just ask for that blood covering upon us, and we will receive it, Lord. And if there's anybody here that hasn't done that tonight, I would just plead with you, just reach out to the Savior, reach out to Jesus and ask for that covering, and he will do it. He'll meet you where you're at. And for those of us who have, God, that we can just bear that testimony, that we can just be gospel to the world, that we can just be a light to those around us. Just give us just divine appointments to even share just the truth and the hope that is within us, God. Pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen.